Good evening. I'm Molly Duffy, and I'm the Executive Director of the Valley Forge Park Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our speaker series, which is sponsored by the Sharon H. and Bruce A. Bakke Foundation. Thank you, Sharon. So happy April to everybody. Happy spring. So after tonight, we're looking forward to two more speakers for this year in May and June. And then we will begin planning for next year. So while you're watching tonight and while you're thinking about it after tonight, if you have ideas for what you'd like to see next fall, let us know. We're so happy to be able to do this year via Zoom. And I know that next year, I hope that next year we'll be able to do some back in person again. So let us know what you would like to see and where you might like to see it. And in the meantime, we're planning our Lunch and Learn, which happens in the summer and is kind of a speaker series light. So we have that to look forward to as well. So now for just a few technical details that are important. I would recommend that you put your Zoom session in speaker view. And there's an icon in the upper right portion of your Zoom screen that will allow you to toggle between speaker view and gallery view. Speaker view is less distracting as it allows you to see only who is currently presenting. There's also a Q&A chat that's during our Zoom webinar. So you can use that to submit questions, whether they're substantive questions or technical questions if you're having any trouble with the webinar. The Q&A chat icon is in the bottom portion of your Zoom window, and feel free to use it anytime during the event. And so now I would like to introduce our speaker. An award-winning educator, Professor Carolyn Roberts specializes in the history of medicine, and she holds a joint appointment in the departments of history, history of science and medicine, and African American studies at Yale University. Her research interests concern early modern medicine and overlapping themes of race and slavery, natural history and botany, and African indigenous knowledge in the Atlantic world, illuminating case studies to question crises of race and health in the present day. Roberts is currently working on a book project entitled To Heal and to Harm, Medicine, Knowledge, and Power in the Atlantic Slave Trade, a full-length study of the history of medicine in the British slave trade. So Professor Roberts, welcome and thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you so much. I want to also thank Justin for inviting me to be a part of this series. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. And so let's get started. I am going to now share my screen so that we can begin. All right. So as we begin thinking about African and African American contributions to colonial America, it's so important for us to begin with Africa. And so I have here a quote: "Healing traditions in sub-Saharan Africa have been developing for over 3,000 years and represent one of the most developed medical traditions in the world, along with India and China." In the research and writing that I do on the transatlantic slave trade, the importance of African medical knowledge to Europeans comes through very strongly in the documentary evidence. And I want to give you just a few examples. So this is the writing of a Dutchman named Willem Bosum, who was stationed at the Gold Coast in present-day Ghana. And he wrote in 1705, "The green herbs, the principal remedy in use amongst the Negroes, are of such wonderful efficacy that 'tis much to be deplored that no European physician has yet applied himself to the discovery of their nature and virtue. For I don't only imagine, but firmly believe that they would prove more successful in the practice of physic, which is medicine, than the European preparations." And here is another example. As commentary like this continued, this letter is from the Royal African Company archives, and it was written in 1720, and it reads, "We should be glad to have the assistance of an able gardener, one that is well acquainted with herbs, as we believe there may be many simples or medicines found here of very great benefit, being observed to be made use of by the natives in pharmacy as well as surgery, and who succeed in many good cures in both." So one of the medicines that Europeans observed being used in West Africa at this time was velvet tamarind. African doctors soaked the pulp of the fruit in water and then consumed the resulting beverage, and it was considered a great and effective fever remedy. Researchers today have confirmed the analgesic, antimicrobial, antibacterial, and antimalarial qualities of velvet tamarind. Another medicine they observed was African basil, which was a fever remedy as well. And Africans would boil the leaves to create a decoction that was not only drunk, but it was used in a steam bath 4 times a day. In chemical screenings, we know that the essential oils in the leaves contain significant antimalarial qualities. So researchers today confirm that a steam bath is actually the most effective way for obtaining the antimalarial benefits. So when enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas by way of the slave trade, they brought their cultures of healing and curing with them. Judith Carney very helpfully writes, quote, "One legacy of the Atlantic slave trade is the lingering failure to consider its victims as deliberate botanical agents. Plantation reliance upon forced migration of enslaved Africans delivered a steady infusion of African plant knowledge in the region." So enslaved people across the Americas, from Massachusetts to Brazil, became renowned as healers. Some of our plant species are named after enslaved people, which is an example here. You see Majo bitters is named after Majo. She was an enslaved healer in Jamaica, and she used this plant to cure yaws and venereal disease. Another plant named after an enslaved person is bitter root, or Quassia amara. It's named after Quassi, who was an enslaved man in Suriname. He effectively used the plant as a fever remedy, a stomach tonic, and restorative, and it became one of Suriname's major drug exports. And in the United States, this was true as well. So what you see before you is an article that was published in the Carolina Gazette in 1750, "The Negro Caesar's Cure for Poison," and likewise his cure for the bite of a rattlesnake, for discovering of which the General Assembly hath thought it fit to purchase his freedom and grant him an allowance of 100 pounds per annum during life. So Caesar was a well-known healer in South Carolina. And we know that Caesar's cure was still being used and publicized in 1881. And the writer of this medical brief mentions that his father was an eyewitness to the efficacy of the remedy. So these are just a few examples of the evidence that exists, confirming the important role played by African and African descended people as medical practitioners. But I want to turn now to focus on 2 events that speak directly to major historical events in colonial America that often exclude Black people, although they were central to the story. And these 2 are the smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1721 and the famous yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793. So a smallpox outbreak swept the city of Boston in 1721. People were terrified and they were fleeing for their lives. And they had good reason, because smallpox was one of the world's most feared diseases at this time. Smallpox is a highly lethal and highly contagious disease, And in the early 18th century, approximately 1 out of every 10 people who caught the disease died from it. So in Boston, the population was roughly 11,000 inhabitants. Over 6,000 cases of smallpox were reported, so it was a very dire situation. And this is where the enslaved man Onesimus enters the picture. So who was Onesimus? Onesimus was an enslaved man given as a gift to Cotton Mather from his church. So Cotton Mather was a famous preacher in colonial America. Onesimus is described as a gentleman well known in Boston, had a Garamanti servant. Oh no, the gentleman well known in Boston is Cotton Mather. The Garamanti servant is Onesimus. So Garamanti means Coromantee, which is a name given to enslaved people who were Akan. And Onesimus told Cotton Mather about the common practice of smallpox inoculation where he was from in West Africa. Cotton Mather got additional confirmation from other Africans in Boston as well. And this is how he described the practice. So in Cotton Mather's words, afterwards, he successfully met with a number of Africans who all in their plain way, without any combination or correspondence, agreed in one story, that in their country, where they used to die like rotten sheep when the smallpox gets among them, it has now become a common thing to cut a place or two in their skin, sometimes one place and sometimes another, and put in a little of the matter of the smallpox, after which they, in a few days, grow a little sick, and a few smallpox break out, and by they dry away, and that nobody ever died of doing this, nor ever had the smallpox after it. So you may have been able to glean that what Cotton Mather is describing is inoculation. Inoculation is when you take pus or scabs from someone suffering from the disease, you puncture the skin with a needle that has been contaminated with the smallpox matter, and this produces a milder, less lethal form of smallpox, and survival confers immunity. So inoculation, or it's also called variolation, had been long practiced in Africa and in Asia, but it was unknown in Europe. And the knowledge that Onesimus and other Black Bostonians gave to Cotton Mather produced quite a backlash. The press went wild. There is not a race of men on earth more false liars, one publication said about the Black Bostonians. Cotton Mather's home was also firebombed. A note was attached to the bomb which said, "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you. I'll inoculate you with this, a pox to you." But Cotton Mather fought back, and this is what he said. "It is common practice and is attended with success. I have as full an evidence of this as I have that there are lions in Africa, and I don't know why 'tis more unlawful to learn of Africans how to help against the poison of the smallpox than it is to learn of our Indians how to help against the poison of a rattlesnake." A Boston doctor named Zabdiel Boylston took Cotton Mather's advice and began experimenting with inoculation. 98% of his patients survived. And so between 1721 and 1796, smallpox inoculation became more common. And then in 1798, physician Edward Jenner in England developed the first vaccine for smallpox. So while the history books will tell us about Zabdiel Boylston's experiments and Edward Jenner's vaccination, Onesimus and other Black Bostonians are unrecognized contributors to the history of the eradication of smallpox and part of the broader history of vaccination in the United States. But now we turn to Philadelphia. In 1793, Philadelphia was one of the richest cities in the new United States. It had recovered from the ravages of the Revolutionary War, and Philadelphia was dominated by American economic and cultural life. Ships choked the Delaware River with commerce, and Philadelphia was also the temporary capital of the new republic. So the federal government made its home there during the 1790s. You might have bumped into President George Washington as you walked along the bustling streets surrounding the American Philosophical Society. Although Philadelphia was over 90% white, it was also home to what was quickly becoming the largest and wealthiest free Black population in the Western world. So while many African Americans worked as mariners and day laborers and domestic servants, others were doctors, teachers, clergymen, hairdressers, tailors, food caterers, and musicians. But then yellow fever struck. If you had been one of Philadelphia's 55,000 residents in 1793 during the yellow fever outbreak, it would have seemed as if your world was truly shattering. In 1793, white and Black refugees from the Haitian Revolution settled in Philadelphia and Baltimore, and they brought the yellow fever virus with them. The culprit was the Aedes aegypti mosquito. The disease is transmitted to humans by the bite of infected mosquitoes. It's not spread through person-to-person contact. And so this mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, was very actively involved in this disease outbreak. So what is yellow fever? Yellow fever is categorized as a viral hemorrhagic fever, or VHF. And VHFs are characterized by fever and coagulation abnormalities. And what this means is that the body's blood clotting mechanism is disrupted. And what ends up happening is a severe multi-system syndrome, which means that multiple organ systems are affected. It's highly infectious, it kills quickly, often within 7 to 10 days. So the symptoms of yellow fever. The patient will present with fever, with chills, fatigue, severe headache, malaise, dizziness, nausea, delirium, loss of appetite, vomit that was green, yellow, or black, muscle pain, and also bleeding from the eyes, nose, mouth, anus, and vagina. So this was a horrible and painful way to die. The disease was called by some black vomit because of how copious amounts of black mucus and dried blood was expelled. And people would be screaming in pain and yelling out with delirium, often seeming to go mad. Individuals sometimes had to be restrained from jumping out of windows or committing other forms of self-harm. So the city was in panic. Of the 55,000 residents in the city, 20,000 fled the city for safety, and they poured out on the roads by horse, carriage, and on foot. They were fleeing as fast as they could. The bodies of the dead began piling up in homes and on streets. If people left their homes, they often covered their mouths with vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs. They walked down the center of the busy streets to get away from the contagion that dwelled inside people's houses. People of all ages also tried smoking tobacco, believing it could help prevent the illness. It also got very violent and cruel on the streets of Philadelphia. There were reports of married couples abandoning one another upon the onset of symptoms, and parents abandoning their children. You could be ostracized and left out in fields to die alone with no aid and no assistance. No one wanted to be near you because they thought the disease spread person to person. Eventually, 5,000 people would be dead. 1/10 of the city's population perished. And in the early stages of this desperate crisis, a man named Benjamin Rush reached out to the African American community. Benjamin Rush was an important figure. As many of you must know, he was one of the founding fathers. He was a politician. He was a physician trained at Edinburgh. He was a chemist. He was the first professor of chemistry in the US. He's considered the father of American psychiatry and published the first psychiatric textbook printed in the US. And Rush was a staunch abolitionist. He was secretary of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Rush was also a social reformer, including prison reform. Now, Benjamin Rush believed strongly in the medical ability of Black people. And Benjamin Rush was considered the most prominent doctor in the United States at this time. For example, Benjamin Rush considered James Durham a colleague. James Durham was born into slavery in 1762 in Philadelphia and is considered the first recognized Black physician in the US. Two of Durham's enslavers in Philadelphia were doctors. In 1783, James Durham was sold to a doctor in New Orleans, where Durham treated patients of all races. And eventually, he won his freedom and set up a private practice in New Orleans, becoming a specialist in throat medicine, particularly the disease diphtheria, which was a dangerous and often fatal disease that infected the nose and throat. So Benjamin Rush tells us the following about James Durham. I have conversed with him upon the most acute and epidemic diseases of the country where he lives, and was pleased to find him perfectly acquainted with the modern simple mode of practice in those diseases. I expected to have suggested some new medicines to him, but he suggested many more to me. He speaks French fluently and has some knowledge of the Spanish language. Benjamin Rush also gives us insight into the important work being performed by African Americans when he describes his Black assistant, Marcus. Rush says that he can turn his two hands to 100 different things. He puts up powders, spreads blisters, and gives clysters, which are enemas, equal to any apothecary in town. With a little instruction, he would exceed many of our bark and wine doctors in the treatment of the present fever. But Rush also believed that Black people had a special kind of immunity to yellow fever. Black people do not have a natural immunity to yellow fever, but this was the belief at the time. For example, John Lining, a doctor from South Carolina, famously wrote in 1748, "There is something very singular in the constitution of the Negroes, which renders them not liable to this fever." So for Rush, the idea of Black immunity to yellow fever prompted him to reach out to Philadelphia's Black population to get their assistance. So after describing Black people's immunity to yellow fever, Rush wrote, "The only design of this remark is to suggest to our citizens the safety and propriety of employing Black people to nurse and attend persons infected by this fever. Also to hint to the Black people that a noble opportunity was now put into their hands." So if Black people were not susceptible to the disease, they were now being asked to provide medical care to the white population. And the people Benjamin Rush reached out to were his longtime associates, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. So both Absalom Jones and Richard Allen were born into slavery. Jones was from Delaware and Allen was from Pennsylvania. As boys, both men's families were separated by being sold off. And as young men, both were able to save enough money through their industry and entrepreneurship to purchase their freedom. For those of you who might be interested in religious history, Jones and Allen are very important figures. Both men were members of a segregated church, St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. And Jones and Allen both worked as lay preachers and evangelists. So the Black population at the church grew, but this growth disturbed the white congregants. And so famously, in 1786, 7 years before the yellow fever epidemic, Jones and other Black congregants were kneeling in prayer before the altar at the church. They were on the main floor of the church, and ushers got them off their knees and tried to force them to sit in the balcony. Allen wrote, quote, "We all went out of the church in a body, and they were no longer plagued by us," end quote. The following year, in 1787, the two men founded the Free African Society, which became the first African-American mutual aid society. And out of the Free African Society came a new Christian denomination called African Methodist Episcopal, which was founded by Richard Allen. So Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were the two men responsible for mobilizing the Black community to take on major public health interventions during the yellow fever epidemic. It was a masterful undertaking. The two men strategized with the mayor of Philadelphia and with Benjamin Rush. Priority was to provide medical care to the sick. Jones and Allen organized a corps of workers. They staffed the hospital with African-American nurses. The nurses provided patient care and assisted doctors on their rounds. Nurses also made home visits to the sick, traveling on horseback, by carriage, or on foot. During home visits, these nurses performed venesection to remove corrupted blood from veins using surgical tools. They administered enemas, they applied blisters to the skin, they compounded medicines, and they prepared chemical remedies. There was a corps of street cleaners that kept streets free of dirt and human waste and corpses. Foot patrollers made sure streets were kept safe, and they tried to prevent violence, theft, and other crimes. Home inspectors checked homes to identify where the sick and dead were located. People described as carters removed the dead bodies. Grave diggers helped prepare the dead for burial and interred their bodies. So this was a massive public health mobilization effort that Black Philadelphians carried out during the new nation's worst public health crisis to date. Black people risked their lives and got sick from the disease themselves, including Richard Allen. Some African Americans died while performing this labor. They were not actually immune. But what was the response to their labor? To the fact that they risked their lives to rescue the city from disease and to help the white population? Well, the response was rampant hostility. Many white Philadelphians did not respond well. One historian named John Edgar Wideman wrote, "People who would never dream of having a Black person enter their front door, let alone their bedroom, were now dependent on a Black person who was wielding a knife and who entered the bedroom and opened a vein." Racial bias meant many white people believed their lives depended on, quote, "the exertions and attentions of these despised people, left to the care of merciless and perhaps drunken Black people." Matthew Carey led an attack against the Black population. He distributed this pamphlet and made sure it was read widely. Although he wasn't even in the city during the disease, he leveled accusations against the Black healthcare workers. One group of people Carey attacked were the Black nurses. So Carey accused the Black nurses who worked during the epidemic as some of the vilest of the Blacks. They extorted $2, $3, $4, and even $5 a night for attendance, which would have been well paid by a single dollar. Some of them were even detected in plundering the houses of the sick. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen responded to these lies. The two men published a pamphlet, which was the first federally copyrighted essay by African American writers. And we can think of this important publication as being part of a long, robust history of African Americans using the printed word to fight against racism. In this text, Jones and Allen begin by contesting the myth that Black people are immune to yellow fever. And they write, "When the people of color had the sickness and died, we were imposed upon and told it was not with the prevailing sickness until it became too notorious to be denied. Then we were told some few died, but not many. Thus were our services extorted at the peril of our lives. Yet you accuse us of extorting a little money from you. And the authors dispute at length the attacks made against the Black nurses. So remember that delirium and madness are among the symptoms of yellow fever. The authors write, the case of the nurses, in many instances, were deserving commiseration, the patient raging and frightful to behold. It has frequently required two persons to hold them from running away. Others have made attempts to jump out of a window. In many chambers, they were nailed down, and the door was kept locked to prevent them from running away or breaking their necks. Others lay vomiting blood and screaming enough to chill them with horror. Thus were many nurses circumstanced, alone, until the patient died, then called away to another scene of distress, and thus have been for a week or 10 days left to do the best they could without any sufficient rest, many of them having some of their dearest connections sick at the time and suffering for want, while their husband, wife, father, or mother have been engaged in the service of the white people. So African Americans in Philadelphia risked their lives in order to prove their humanity and equality. But many people ended up rejecting these efforts. Black Philadelphians were at the center of the new nation's first major public health crisis. Yet in public health classes, you will not hear about them, and you will not hear about the Black nurses. Even today, Black nurses continue to fight for dignity and respect. This is an image of the nursing staff at Mercy Hospital in 1920. This is an image of Black women in the Army Nursing Corps in World War I. Racism in nursing is an open secret. And this is an article from 2017. Someone saying, I don't want any colored nurses in my room. For some working in the medical industry, these are words they hear frequently. This was a tweet exchanged. To be forced to watch a child die that you know you could have saved is soul crushing. The baby died because his parents refused to allow a Black nurse to save his life. And this isn't the first time I've seen this happen. Sick. So these are just a few examples of how racism continues to attack and prevent Black people from thriving as healthcare providers. Black doctors, nurses, and others struggle for recognition and respect. The medical and nursing students that I work with at Yale and across the country tell tales of racism in hospital settings that would make you weep. And so this story of how African Americans have contributed to medicine in colonial America is part of an ongoing story of struggle and pain, of sacrifice and of despair. But we can also look at this story of African American contributions to medicine in colonial America as perhaps a happy, positive version of a much darker story that would unfold in 19th century America. During the 19th century, African Americans would contribute even more to American medicine by way of their sick and dead bodies. In the 19th century, newspapers contained advertisements like this to entice slaveholders to sell their sick slaves for medical research. This is from the Charleston Mercury. Wanted 50 Negroes. Any person having sick Negroes considered incurable by their respective physicians and wishing to dispose of them, Dr. Stillman will pay cash for Negroes. The highest cash price will be paid as above. Enslaved people's bodies were forced into medical service. Something new was happening in the United States. Scientific medicine was beginning to take root, and doctors needed bodies both alive and dead to understand more about how organs and tissues were impacted by disease. There was an enormous demand for sick patients and cadavers for study. Yet among the white population, hospitals were undesirable. Medical care largely continued in the home, and dissection was considered an affront. So slavery created a population of people who were forced to comply. This is a slave narrative written by an enslaved man named John Brown, who was subjected to painful medical experiments. Yet John Brown was not alone. A slave named Sam was pinned down into a chair by 5 physicians so that his lower jawbone could be removed without anesthesia. Dr. Walter Jones in Virginia poured boiling water on naked enslaved pneumonia patients at 4-hour intervals to test their pain threshold. Dr. John Hardin stripped blood vessels from the limbs of an enslaved man and from 3 hogs to measure their arteries for comparison. Dr. James Dugas performed experimental eye surgeries on Black subjects. Yet J. Marion Sims' experiments on enslaved women are particularly well known today. As one British surgeon noted, you could cut into the bodies of negresses like you did rabbits or dogs. J. Marion Sims did just that. Pictured here are 3 enslaved women, Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, women we now refer to as the mothers of gynecology. Dr. J. Marion Sims of Montgomery, Alabama, was trying to find a surgical cure for vesicovaginal fistula, where an abnormal opening forms between the bladder and the walls of the vagina, causing urine to leak out of the vagina. And it's an incredibly painful condition, often leading to incontinence. So the enslaved women were his research subjects. Sims operated on Anarcha, the woman pictured in the center, 30 times over a period of 5 years without anesthesia, although ether was available. He believed Black women didn't feel as much pain as white women. Over and over and over again, he scarified, sutured, and resutured her vagina. When the surgery was finally perfected with silver sutures rather than lead, Sims treated the white women of Montgomery and made sure to give them anesthesia. Sims remains a part of our lives today. His vaginal speculum is still used during gynecological exams. So by utilizing the bodies of Black women, doctors advanced their understanding of how to remove burst ovaries, deliver stillborn children, stop intrauterine bleeding, fix fused labias, repair obstetrical fistula, remove ovarian tumors. The first full uterine removal was done by Dr. Paul Eve on enslaved women, and cesarean sections, 30 of 37 experimental cesarean sections were performed on Black women in 1830. But while medical experimentation was done on the living, enslaved people's dead bodies were also used for dissection. Here's another advertisement from the Charleston Mercury. No place in the United States offers as great opportunities for the acquisition of anatomical knowledge, subjects being obtained from among the colored population in sufficient numbers for every purpose, and proper dissections carried on without offending any individuals in the community. And those are italics from the actual newspaper ad. When Harriet Martineau visited Baltimore in 1835, she wrote, "The bodies of colored people exclusively are taken for dissection because whites do not like it and the colored people cannot resist." Enslaved people's bodies became part of a lucrative national cadaver trade that shuttled Black people's corpses from Texas to New Hampshire. Few enslaved people rested in peace. Death did not end their commodification. And I want to show now just 2 images of these dissections, but I want to warn you that it's gruesome and explicit. So please avert your eyes as necessary.
Those are certainly some sobering images to end the lecture with. So certainly they do tell a very vivid picture.
I'm going to just give a very brief conclusion as we think about these two overlapping themes that I've just described. So as we think about African American contributions to medicine, colonial America gives us a tiny slice of how our broader society has treated the outstanding and sometimes sacrificial medical labor and healthcare knowledge possessed by African and African descended people. The smallpox epidemic and the yellow fever epidemic show us the very hardened racial attitudes that were already taking place and existing against people of African descent. Yet the brutality of the 19th century, when Black people would be forced to make contributions to American medicine through medical exploitation, is also a crucial part of the story. So you see, we have two themes. First, we have groundbreaking African American medical knowledge. And second, we have the brutal medical exploitation of African Americans. Both represent contributions to American medicine. Both themes would continue through the 19th century and the 20th century, and even into our present moment. The relationship between Black people and American medicine remains contested, fraught, and difficult. It is a story of both healing and harming. And my personal hope is that in the long arc of justice, that we might move a few steps closer to healing. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you as well. I apologize for stepping in for that brief moment. There was a pause and I thought you were just going to end on the pictures.
Yeah, it's, I often, the images are sort of difficult to take in. So I do like to leave a little bit of a pause, yes, because it's an intense kind of story, you know, and it's also not as familiar to a lot of people. So it can also feel jarring and shocking to be exposed to just the tip of the iceberg of a really difficult history.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a few questions that have been posted. Taking this historically, chronologically, anti-inoculation campaigns or efforts that took place. Did racism, was that a factor in these anti-inoculation efforts due to the African origins of inoculation?
Yes, absolutely. Which is why in the screen, in the quote that I shared, I'm going to read it again, from Cotton Mather, who is saying that because his house was firebombed, I mean, they were very, very angry about it because the only knowledge coming to the people of Boston about inoculation was coming from African people, from enslaved people. And so that's why Cotton Mather makes that statement, isn't, you know, we should be able to take the knowledge that African people have, just as we take knowledge about curing poison from snake bites from Native American people, that even though these people are not white and that they're considered of a lower status in various ways, we should be able to take their word for it. You know, there were other conversations going on in Britain during this period of time because British people and other Europeans were realizing that inoculation was happening in Turkey, in China, and in all of these other non-Western countries. And so the desire to sort of experiment with it was coming from many directions. But in the context of Boston, it was specifically because this knowledge was coming from enslaved people. And in the context of Boston, they're of a lower status. And, by the time you get to 1721, the anti-Black attitudes have been circulating for over 100 years. So the idea that Africans are savages, that they do not know how to live, that they're sexually deviant, that they're monstrous, that they're dangerous, all of those ideas, begin in the 1400s when the Portuguese first go to Africa in the context of the slave trade. And so, when we have attitudes like that coming from, our founding fathers, people like Thomas Jefferson writing about African people as he has this famous statement in the Notes on the State of Virginia, their griefs are transient. This idea that Black people don't even feel the same level of emotional pain. Benjamin Rush, who I spoke about, he's an incredible individual, a staunch abolitionist, but he believed Black people didn't feel as much pain as white people because he believed that Black skin was caused from leprosy, and it made their skin more durable and their nervous systems less sensitive. So there's a lot of ideas that by the time we get to Boston in 1721 or to Thomas Jefferson in the Notes on the State of Virginia in 1783, that these ideas are just common sense. It's just part of the logic of the period. And so that's why when you hear someone like Benjamin Rush giving credence to African and African descended medical practice and knowledge, it's really sort of a big deal. And also for Cotton Mather to say he's going to trust these individuals who you've been told and taught to believe are animals and savages and should be enslaved. So yeah, there's a lot of racism going on in this period of time. It's an older, longer sort of history.
Yeah. And one of our attendees made the comment, and smallpox, this was a practice that saved lives at Valley Forge. So Valley Forge being the site where the Continental Army had a mass inoculation campaign for all the soldiers, one of the first large state-sponsored programs of its kind. But that does bring up an interesting question. There were between 500 to 700 Black soldiers enlisted in the Army here at Valley Forge, countless more civilians. So the question is, do you think there's a hidden history of African-American medicine that might be running parallel within the Black community, perhaps even during the war within these military encampments?
Oh, definitely. There's in the context of the Civil War, for example, when you had a lot of Black people enlisting, it was, the Civil War, when you learn about Civil War medicine, sort of the standard tale, which is it's true for white soldiers. There were a lot of huge medical breakthroughs going on. But the reality for Black soldiers is that they couldn't get white doctors willing to serve them. And so the story for Black doctors is that you have people like Harriet Tubman, who is helping provide medicine and serving as a nurse during the Civil War. You have Susie Taylor Douglas, who's offering a similar kind of labor to care for Black soldiers. And so I'm not sure about the situation, for example, in Valley Forge and in this, in what's being described. But I know that in research on the Civil War, when they're looking at the medical care and the medical practices, that there's always been an African descended medical sort of need for medical care. And this continues all the way through. I mean, really, it continues all the way through the 20th century, because if you want to follow the story forward, you have enslaved women who are serving as the midwives and doing a lot of care on the plantations in the 19th century. When the Civil War ends, when enslaved people are now considered free, Then you have segregated healthcare and Jim Crow laws throughout the country, whether by law or by custom. And so Black people had to start things like Negro Health Week, and they had to have Black women's public health campaigns in their communities. And, you know, there were throughout the country, there were plenty of places where Black people couldn't get any medical care in a white context. And if they did, it would be in a substandard, it would be substandard care. They would be treated in, you know, the Black hospital wing would be in a dank basement, and the room where they would be seen by the doctor would be in a janitor's closet, for example. I mean, it was really, it's not a story of sort of equal access. And so Black people have had to, throughout the entire time they've been in this country, they've had to really look out for themselves and care for one another as much as they could. As you know, of course, medical experimentation is still going on. It continues into Tuskegee and beyond. And so, so there's always been a sense of distrust because of that.
So you talked a bit about how African Americans were the subject of medical experimentation with the rise of scientific medicine in the 19th century. Now, the professionalization of medicine in the 18th century, there's often a focus, particularly in the Midwife's Tale, a very popular book by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, that the professionalization of medicine was often at the expense of female practitioners of medicine, whether they're midwives or other nurses or some other medical roles. So do you see a similar development across racial lines, that there were medical practitioners within the Black community that were sidelined with the professionalization of medicine when it's taken out of the household and put into the hospitals?
So yeah, so in terms of periodization, so the 18th century, in Ulrich's book, the rise of the male midwife is very much an 18th century story. But it's, in some ways, it predates the rise of scientific medicine, which is in the United States, at least, which is about almost 100 years behind Europe because of the Revolutionary War and just all of the churning that happens. All the medical schools and hospitals aren't really being built until we're getting into the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. And so it's really at that point when you start having doctors being trained in a more professional manner and really separating themselves out from the homeopaths and the other people that are practicing medicine. So at that period of time, you would have mainly white doctors that are operating. And in terms of the plantations, you still have midwives that are taking care of the majority of the Black population. The difference in gender that I see happening really doesn't come until after the Civil War, when you start having the opening of Black medical schools. Because of segregation, they have to have their own medical schools. They end up building their own hospitals and things like that. And it's at that point where, you know, it's the sense of it's masculinity. It's like Black masculinity, professionalism. You know, they want to have their place, and it's difficult for women during that period of time. So we're talking about the late 19th century at that point. We're talking about the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and then, you know, into the early part of the 20th century. And so it would be difficult. But, you know, the numbers of Black practitioners, you know, today, in terms of Black medical practitioners across the board, regardless of gender, only make up about 6% of the entire sort of the population of doctors. And, you know, in the 19th century, the numbers weren't that different. So it's been a slow process.
So we've had a few questions asking about any further literature or references that you could recommend. We send out a link of a recording of this this video to those who registered. So we could possibly send out some further reading suggestions in that email. So is it okay if I hit you up for a few reading recommendations?
Yeah. So my favorite text for looking at the yellow fever epidemic is Rana Hogarth's Medicalizing Blackness. It does an excellent job of talking about yellow fever in the context of Philadelphia and looking at how the body was being sort of understood by way of racial difference. And it's very readable. The yellow fever is only in one chapter, but the rest of the book is really, really interesting as well, because that transition that I've been talking about when scientific medicine comes, the rise of hospitals and all of those things in the United States, she does, in that book, Rana Hogarth does a little bit of almost like a prehistory, showing that a lot of the doctors in that 19th century moment are actually gaining their knowledge from what doctors are doing in the British Caribbean. And so by the time you get to the 19th century and students are writing their medical theses on supposed Negro diseases, it's coming out of an older tradition where knowledge is coming out of the Caribbean. And so she shows really well the relationship between the Caribbean and the United States in this particular time. And also that hospitals didn't begin, they didn't all of a sudden start abusing and exploiting, Black people. That you had this earlier moment before the rise of hospitals really took off, which he captures. Hospitals were just not, they were not spaces of health and healing in this period of time. People got their healthcare at home. And so she traces the beginning of some of these early hospitals at the end of the 18th century into the very beginning of the 19th century before scientific medicine takes off. And by scientific medicine, I mean the idea that you're no longer thinking about the body in terms of humoral medicine. You're not thinking that disease is caused by an imbalance of fluids, but you're starting to understand for the first time the role of disease in organs and tissues. And so that's why all of a sudden you need bodies, because you need to see their organs and tissues. And so that's the beginning of a change that's happening at that period. So I think that would be a really great text. The Judith Carney's books, I mean, all of them, everything she's ever written is extraordinary. If you're interested in thinking about the concept of migrant ethnobotany and how enslaved people from Africa were able to sort of learn about and figure out the new world that they were in terms of plant-based knowledge. She does an excellent job of that. She has an essay called With Grains of Rice in Her Hair. And in that essay, she talks about how enslaved people, there's stories of women who, when they're being dragged onto the slave ships, they would put things in their hair, seeds of rice and other plants in their hair, and bring them to the New World. And so the transplant not only of knowledge, but also of the plant species that they were familiar with. She does a great job with that. I think Londa Scheibinger's book, The Secret Cures of Slaves, is a really interesting book if you're interested in thinking about not only enslaved medical knowledge, but also about the very concept of medical experimentation, because medical experimentation took different forms. You know, one of the questions that Londa Schiebinger is asking in this text is, you know, did medical experimentation, like what happened in the US, happen in other places? It was so egregious, it was so brutal, it was so, you know, it was so vile. But when she does studies of an earlier period in the British Caribbean, she doesn't see that in, you know, that it's happening in the same way for a variety of reasons. So it's really interesting also twinning of these two concepts, the idea of medical experimentation and African and African descended medical knowledge.
So another question, what's next for the study of African and African-American contributions to medicine and healing in the Atlantic world? What gaps in the literature still remain? Hopefully your own book, To Heal and to Harm, will fill in some of those gaps in the literature.
Yeah, you know, I think so. So the gap that my book is going to fill, which is just sort of a small part of the larger book manuscript, there's a section where I deal with African knowledge in the context of the slave trade in Africa. And so the gap that I'm trying to fill is what is going on in Africa? How are African people participating in sort of what's going on in the slave trade? How are they caring for people's bodies? What are they doing? A lot of the research that I've just mentioned, it doesn't deal with Africa. They just sort of land in the Americas, and then, you know, we assume that they, you know, must have known something, but we don't really know the extent of what that knowledge was. And so I've discovered enslaved doctors and doctresses and various healers that are in the West African slave trading zones that were enslaved to provide medicine in the context of the slave trade. And so I will be sort of exploring their stories and talking about their healing practices. Smallpox comes up as well, with enslaved healers taking charge of smallpox inoculation. And a lot of the plants that I mentioned that were being observed, used in West Africa, are also part of that research. But I think when we're talking about the Americas writ large, I think that there are two really big gaps. And if we're thinking about the 18th and 19th century. So one is the South Atlantic. So thinking about Latin America, South America, thinking about those spaces. There's been a good amount that's been done on Brazil, for example, but we really are missing a lot of stories of what's going on in other places. Now, Pablo Gomez, this would be another great book to recommend. His book is called The Experiential Caribbean, and it deals with the Spanish Caribbean. And it's an extraordinary book. He talks about Black ritual healers and practitioners in the Spanish Caribbean in the 17th century. And so it's an even earlier study, and it's really wonderful. But we need more coming out of the Spanish Caribbean in the 18th and 19th centuries and in other parts of Latin America. And the other big gap, which I think would be so interesting to figure out, would be the North, the US North and Mid-Atlantic. But, you know, so a lot of the literature that we have about African descended healing, especially in the 19th century, it comes from the slave plantations. Now, an extraordinary book, the book that I think set things in motion for all of us that are studying this field, would be Charla Fett's book, Working Cures, which is all about enslaved medical knowledge on antebellum plantations in the US South. But what is going on in the North during this period of time? You know, this would be an extraordinary kind of study. And we also know that people are settling, people like Rebecca Lee Crumpler, who becomes one of the first Black physicians, Black female physicians, and ends up going to the South, right after the Civil War to help care for people. We know, she was trained in Boston and, got her start in Boston as a nurse. So there are many more stories. In a way, I think that I guess this is the case for all of us who are historians. We feel like, in some ways we're always just barely touching the surface. Of course, the difficulty is the records, the evidence. And, but it's amazing what you can find when you're looking and asking the right questions. And so I feel really excited about the development of this field because, believe it or not, in 2016 was the first international symposium that was devoted to the field of medicine and slavery, because there just wasn't a whole lot of work. And now it's all clustering together and it's coming out. But a lot of it has come out in bulk in the last 5 and 10 years. So it's really an exciting place to be. I don't know if the questioner was thinking about the later period, but in the in African American professional medicine, things have been written about the rise of Black nurses as professionals, and Black doctors, but a whole lot of still needs to be written about that as well. So there's a lot of work that could be done.
So to bring it back to Valley Forge, we have a question here. At Valley Forge, one of the best documented African American couples, it was Hannah and Isaac Till. They had gained their freedom months after the historic encampment here at Valley Forge. Hannah was a pastry chef, her husband also a chef, both of them working at the general's military headquarters. So is there evidence of Black enslaved cooks preparing remedies, either through African traditions or from medicinal receipts? So the question being, Black enslaved cooks.
Yeah, what a great question. Now, there is a graduate student at Yale who just finished, who has written about Black cooks and caterers in Philadelphia. And so I will have to get you her name, Justin, because I don't know if she's published other things about it. But, and I don't know if, and see, this is the problem. This is the problem with the way that, we get structured as academics, is like these narrow specializations. I don't know if she would have thought to ask about medicine, because medicine and history of medicine is a kind of, it's sort of like a narrow field. It's still considered a kind of specialty field. A lot of historians just don't think to go in that direction. But the questioner is making such an important point about the fact that food was medicine for everyone during this period, white or Black. Food was an important medicinal. And there's a wonderful book by Herbert Covey called Herbal and Non-Herbal Slave Remedies. It's something like that. But he talks about plants that are used that are also food. And I know that in my own research, coconuts, pineapples, rice, all of these things have such an important medicinal benefit. And one of the things that I'm going to be arguing in my book is that because enslaved women were the ones doing the food preparation on these slave ships, and when you see the different foods that are being prepared and how they would have had medicinal uses in West Africa, that may have been one of the ways that they smuggled in their own sort of healing in that space. So I'm definitely on I'm on your wavelength with that.
I'll definitely be looking for that dissertation as soon as I get the name
Yeah.
regarding African-American chefs or cooks in Philadelphia. The Tills actually retired to Philadelphia after the war, after they gained their freedom and so on.
Wow. I wonder if they are in this dissertation. This
I am
is
too.
so exciting. I just thank you to that questioner for sharing that. It's wonderful.
But I think that concludes all the questions that we've had. There have been several expressions of gratitude, thanking you for relating the information and how important it is, or enlightening. So yeah, a lot of good comments here, and also expressions of heartbreak over the subject matter, which I think we can all appreciate. So thank you sincerely for my part, and I'll pass things over to Molly.
Thanks, Justin. I echo your sentiment. I don't think we've ever had so many comments and questions from an audience. So clearly you all were as interested in and affected by the talk as I felt. So in closing, I really want to thank Professor Roberts. Thank you for being here tonight with us and for sharing all of this. I'd also like to thank all of the Valley Forge Park Alliance volunteers who made this evening possible. There's actually a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to make this happen. And I'm really glad that Justin Clement could be the moderator tonight, because Justin is the driving force behind the speaker series this year. He assembled speakers from all over the country this year, and that really made up for the fact that we could not gather in person at Valley Forge. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we're already planning for this summer's Lunch and Learn and the fall speaker series. So do stay tuned for more details and let us know your thoughts if you have suggestions. So I'd like to thank again our very generous sponsor, the Sharon H. and Bruce A. Bakke Foundation, who make this event possible. Thank you all for participating in the discussion tonight. And I hope you'll join us on May 4th, wherein our presentation will be called Surviving the Winters, Housing George Washington's Army and the American Revolution. And it's presented by historian Stephen Elliott, PhD, who's an award-winning author, lecturer, and educator. Finally, I want to thank all the Valley Forge Park Alliance members for your wonderful support. You really make our mission possible every day. Last, I'd like to wish you a good night from Valley Forge. I hope to see you in May, and I hope to see you at Valley Forge sometime soon. The Alliance is planning some great in-person events this year that we're really looking forward to. So check out our website for details, and we hope to see you soon. Stay well, and thank you. Good night.